Hello everybody, my name is Henk Berg. I'm a professor at the University of Sheffield and a director of the Prokhof Center. I'm here in Sheffield Cathedral to interview the Anglican priest and broadcaster Giles Fraser. Giles Fraser, welcome to Sheffield Cathedral.
Thank you, nice to be here, mate.
Giles, what I want to do in this interview is a kind of life and works of Giles Fraser,
as it were.
And maybe take things chronologically.
Okay.
So you started off studying philosophy and then you moved to theology.
Very interesting academic. Begins with the life cycle, but begins when you study.
I am an academic
Exactly
after all,
right.
I am a cultural theorist. Talk a little bit about your philosophy degree, because you did your PhD in Nietzsche. Why the interest in Nietzsche?
Well, I started my undergraduate degree, I went up to Newcastle, and I went up to Newcastle. I didn't do terribly well at school, I was trouble at school, and I just thought that philosophy, I mean, it was just almost a sort of, it was almost guesswork really doing philosophy. And it turned out that it was something that I had some aptitude for. And this sort of, the bad boy that I was sort of saved really, and it's a religious word, by Mary Midgley. So I went up there. Mary Midgley was one of the people who was associated with the Newcastle philosophy department. And she slightly took me under her wing and said, look, you can do this, stop sort of like playing the part and knuckle down. And I didn't completely, but I did a bit. And it was a sort of, I went up there, I did sort of quite analytic, it was quite an analytic department. But the two things that really got me were, first of all, Wittgenstein. So Wittgenstein was very important in my development. And, you know, understanding the philosophical investigations to the extent that I did was a sort of moment of revelation, you know, that I achieved something. And then...
It's interesting that you're already couching your philosophy study in religious terminology.
That's probably...
Almost like an epiphany. But,
yeah.
But go on.
But it did have that quality to it. And in fact, even more so is that later on with Wittgenstein, is I went to study Wittgenstein under someone called Norman Malcolm, who was one of the sort of great Wittgenstein scholars. Yeah. And there was about 5 or 6 of us, and we used to sit in King's College London, and we used to sit round on the floor, and we used to go through the philosophical investigations like Bible study. I mean, we'd go through it line by line by line. We'd probably do, 3 hours in the afternoon in King's College, and we'd probably done about 3 sections. So, there's... So Wittgenstein was one, which was very important to me. But Nietzsche, who wasn't on the curriculum, but I sort of got into sort of broad existentialism, European existentialism, Kierkegaard and people like that. And this was much sexier than Hume and Leibniz and so forth to me. Was written in a more exciting way. But also, they were raising questions, but Nietzsche particularly, there were big questions. And, the sort of logic chopping of analytic philosophy, even though it's an important skill, it wasn't really doing what I wanted it to do, which is to sort of raise the big questions. And Nietzsche raised the big questions. And I've often said that Nietzsche was responsible for me to making my way towards Christianity.
Yeah. I think it's kind of visible perhaps in the title of your thesis, which was published with Routledge. It's Redeeming Nietzsche on the Piety of Unbelief.
Yes.
So Nietzsche obviously was an unbeliever. Talk a little bit about the PhD thesis and then maybe about how Nietzsche and philosophy got you into theology.
Well, the thing about Nietzsche is Nietzsche smells very religious. To a religious person, the writing, the style. And this is a puzzle because he's obviously, one of the great atheists. Yeah. He didn't just disagree with God, he didn't just not believe in God, he hated the idea of
Lots of pastors in his family, though.
Lots of Lutheran pastors. So, and in fact, Nietzsche won, in the first year at university, he won the University Preaching Prize. His dad died young, there's quite a lot of Freud you could bring to this. His dad died young, brought up by his mother and with his sister. There was a lot of expectation on him, and you can see how throwing off that expectation was a form of relief for him, was a form of almost like salvation from this sort of rather crushing piety that he'd been brought up with. But Nietzsche thinks of Christianity as that from which you need saving. So Now, this is a very odd thing, because then the language of salvation, and that's the language that would have been there in his Lutheran upbringing, the language of salvation was exactly the language that he brings to atheism. You know, we're saved from Christianity. We're saved from ressentiment. We're saved from all this sort of stuff. And atheism is a form of salvation. You don't get this with Richard Dawkins. You don't get this with the new atheists. That this whole idea that there's some sort of you're freed in this sort of religiously liberating way, almost.
Yeah. It's not that dissimilar to Richard Dawkins, though, is it? I mean, according to Dawkins, religion is also something that people need saving from, and that salvific function is then performed basically by science.
It's not as exciting. It's not as exciting or as iconoclastic. It doesn't feel as much so. It feels much more pedestrian to me than the sort of the full-on culture war that you have with Nietzsche.
Yeah, it's certainly true that if you've read the 19th century philosophers, Nietzsche, but also Feuerbach, then Richard Dawkins is a bit of a disappointment.
Is a bit of a disappointment. Yeah. No, I mean, I've always been a bit. Having studied Nietzsche and been sort of in love with Nietzsche in a funny sort of way, I've always regretted that 20th, 21st century atheism isn't quite as good as it used to be. You know, doesn't quite have the power or the punch or the mission that it had in the 19th century.
So the piety of unbelief is what?
Well, the piety of unbelief is to be liberated from. Is the piety of atheism is to be liberated from. Liberated from what Nietzsche calls ressentiment. That's really very important. The problem with Christian morality, according to Nietzsche, is that if you hit me, Henk, and I can do two things back. I can either hit you back. Now, hitting you back, you're a bit bigger than me, so I'm not sure I would. But if I hit you back, there's a sort of discharge of energy, which is for Nietzsche, there's something healthy about that. If, however, I forgive you, then the energy that I have towards you goes somewhere, and it goes into a sort of anger, a bitterness, a resentment. And you can see this in churches. You can see churches are places where people have tried to do good things, but actually there's a sort of internal bitterness that can happen, which is actually the consequence of doing the right thing, which is quite an irony, really. And so Nietzsche wanted to sort of liberate you from the bitterness, you know, this sort of bitterness, which he thought had infected Western culture.
Let's talk about one of the key concepts in there, which is the concept of kitsch. It's not something that people immediately associate with Nietzsche or even with religion. Why is that concept of kitsch so important to you? Well,
there's a phrase, I think, there was a phrase that kicked me off in my thesis, and I think it's from Alexander Niehamas. It's a long time ago in my thesis, but...
Fair enough.
And he called Nietzsche an armchair philosopher of human riskiness. It's like he has all of this sort of these sort of grand plans, you know, but actually he's a very sedentary coward, almost.
It's a call to living dangerously that Nietzsche makes scribbling in his attic.
Exactly right, that sort of thing. So I started to think about what it was about that I didn't like. And I mean, this is slightly to the side, but there's this essay by Milan Kundera in The Unbearable Lightness of Being, which for me is a sort of staggering piece of work where he develops this idea of kitsch as a moral idea. It's normally an aesthetic idea, but he develops it as a moral idea. And he says that kitsch is, and the quote is, the absolute denial of shit. It's a let's pretend world, kitsch is, where it's like the Disney world, where there's nothing unwholesome. I mean, in a way, it's the sort of all of those Nazi promotional films of, you know, blonde-haired, blue-eyed beauties langloufing through the slopes, and you think, oh, this is just getting each other's flowers and all this. Isn't this a beautiful world? And this beautiful world only exists because all that's considered to be unwholesome has been pushed out of view. And so Kundera calls kitsch the aesthetics of ethnic cleansing. You know, this is a massive sort of claim. Now, this totally took me over as an idea when I was doing my thesis. And I started to think about how this might apply to philosophy. Is there a form of kitsch about highfalutin ideas, whereas you're not interested in the drains or urban planning or just the sort of ordinary stuff of human life? And I thought Nietzsche was a bit of that. I mean, that's one of the things I criticised him for, is that not just the armchair philosopher of human riskiness, but these great castles in the sky, and actually the sort of stuff of human living, the sort of day-to-day domestic stuff and all that was just it's not there in Nietzsche. So that was part of my critique of Nietzsche.
So the idea that Nietzsche has got the way he defines human existence through doing incredibly dangerous things, exceptional things, and then not realizing that maybe a mother, a single mother taking care of her kids is maybe just as heroic or even much more heroic than the people that Nietzsche cites, right, like Napoleon and
all of that sort of stuff. Yeah, that's exactly what it was. And I suppose that's the sort of thing that you'd really think as a parish priest as well when you see exactly those forms of heroism. But actually, this is a sort of romantic heroism, which is not always terribly grounded in ordinary human experience.
Yeah, I've always thought that Nietzsche at bottom is a romantic,
yes,
rather than anything else.
Yes.
Now, from philosophy, you then moved on to theology and decided, I think, to become a priest. How did that, let's use the word epiphany, how did that happen?
Well, the terrible story is there's no great sort of religious road to Damascus type of thing. The truth is, with Nietzsche raised the question of God in such a way that I had to take it seriously, in a way that actually David Hume or these other sort of thinkers that I was doing at university, they didn't for me. But Nietzsche made it urgent for me. So suddenly, you know, he sort of, Kierkegaard as well, another one, and a lot of the sort of, a lot of that continental tradition. And when I was at university, everybody said about me, do you know Giles, he has this extraordinary, it was always like a hobby. You know, he goes off and sits in the back of churches and thinks about life, the universe and everything. And I did for a long time. And I think it's sort of, and I think it sort of grew out of my eyesight, really. It grew upon me as something that was terribly important to me. And then the moment of epiphany, as it were, was recognizing it, recognizing that actually this thing I couldn't help but see the world in this way. And there was a particular moment that happened. It happened in King's College, London. I was reading, and in the library, very academic-y type of thing, and I thought, no, I really have to do something about this. And I got up and I went to find the dean. I said, I want to go and be a priest. It was like terribly naive.
And then you became a dean, I think, in 1993, and a priest in 1994.
A deacon and then a priest. Yes,
yeah.
That's right. And that was an extraordinary business. I mean, the thing is, people think about being a priest that you sort of that you completely understand what it is that you're doing. And part of you doesn't understand what you're doing. You know, it is, you know, when Aquinas talks about faith-seeking understanding, it's like the understanding is still there in the future. You know, something you're trying to... So part of me felt I was writing checks that I didn't know how to cash intellectually. You know, that it was like, this feels exactly, there's quite emotional content to it. This feels like the right thing to do. It feels in the gut a right thing to do. But I'm not quite sure how I explain this fully to myself in intellectual terms. And in fact, I think it stayed like that, probably. But yet it feels exactly the thing that I had to do with in my life.
Yeah. Was it also difficult in the sense that, you know, we talked about Nietzsche and, you know, sort of the heroism of ordinary life. But then, of course, when you become a priest, it does, or it can become very ordinary. It becomes a job.
It's pastoral, yes.
Isn't that also then difficult because it becomes almost sort of pedestrian, that some of the magic that you think maybe when you're studying theology, and you think, oh, being a priest will be great and I'll be able to help people and comfort people, and then maybe you spend a large amount of your time, I don't know, form filling or in meetings?
No, not as much as that as you'd think, but even the Anglican Church hasn't got as sort of like constipated by bureaucracy as the academy, thank goodness. But the one thing that it does do...
I'm jealous now. Because we have all become very corporate.
Yeah, you have. And we haven't. I mean, there's a bit of it, but we haven't. No. The thing that sort of knocks the heroism is the fact that your job is bounded to 3 or 4 square miles in a parish. And I remember saying when I was very early on as a priest, it's like, please, can you just take me out to Tesco's? You know, I just need to get out of this. Anything to sort of like, the world seemed quite small. But of course, the drama that's going on in people's lives that you get, that you are alongside, is extraordinary, is enormous. And that's the great privilege. That is the great privilege of being a priest.
Yeah, and then you became, is it called Canon Chancellor of St. Paul's?
Yeah, a bit after. I did a few other jobs. I went to I went to Oxford to be college chaplain for a bit, and then I had a parish in London, and then I went to St. Paul's. Yeah, so I went to St. Paul's, and
that was 2009, wasn't it?
Was it? That sounds about right. Yeah, I'm terrible with dates.
What did you do there? What was your job?
I was canon theologian. I was the sort of the commissar, I guess, the sort of like the theology officer there. That was part of my job. It was also part of my job to engage with the City of London at quite an extraordinary time when the financial crash had just happened. So that was sort of intellectually very challenging. So there was all of that. And then there was the rhythm of the cathedral, which was the rhythm of morning and evening prayer and that sort of worshipping life of the cathedral. And it's very interesting rhythms. On the one hand, you've got the City of London, going a million miles an hour. And then you've got the cathedral right in the middle of it with this completely different pace set around, these ancient liturgies and so forth.
Yeah.
That's an extraordinary contrast.
So what exactly is it that you do with the city?
Well, it was a sort of moral engagement, I guess. So there was a sort of think tank attached to St. Paul's, and I guess the question that was on everybody's lips then was: is there such a thing as moral capitalism? Can a moral capitalism? Is there something that we can do to? And all of what had happened is the governments had bailed out the banks that had failed. They bailed out the banks with our money. This was socialism for the rich. Sort of. So the banks had done this extraordinary thing where all of their profits were privatized, all of their losses were socialized.
Yeah.
This was a shocking state of affairs, and this is really one of the things that's issued into the sort of the sort of social crises that we have now, is the fact that, personally, I think I'd have let the banks go bust, and I think that might needed to have happened. But those are the sorts of things that we were talking about.
That would have been pretty rough on a
very
lot
rough
of people.
On a lot of people.
Not
yes.
just
No.
But ordinary people.
But no, completely right. But the problem is whether there's a sort of long, slow burn of roughness in propping up this system, which itself is, will these things happen again? I don't know. That's the...
Well, they put a lot of restrictions in
That's
place,
exactly true.
But arguably not enough. And then, of course, now these restrictions seem to be, being sort of removed.
One of the key important things was, the need to pull apart the sort of banking where you and I put our money, go to Lloyd's, and the sort of casino type of operations where that money was speculated on the markets. Yeah. Now, the separation of those two things, there's been a degree of separation, but that's a really important thing. Also, banks having enough money put aside so that if there's a crash, if there's a crisis, that they can actually pay for themselves. Perhaps I was wrong about, let them go bust. But part of my instinct was, how can these people get bailed out by millions of pounds
money,
worth
yes.
of public money? Yeah.
So I think you were very, as far as I can tell, very happy there and were doing good work, but then suddenly it all came to an end. How did that happen?
Occupy. So the Occupy movement arrived in, I didn't know anything about it, arrived in St Paul's. It was originally supposed to be an occupation of the Stock Exchange, and the London Stock Exchange, and the land around the Stock Exchange was privately owned. Actually, it's owned by the Church of England, but that's another thing. It was privately owned, and the police cordoned the area off, and so the protesters ended up on the steps of St Paul's. And people will perhaps remember that a number of months there was
all the tents outside.
There was all the tents outside, and there was the 1% and the 99%, and there was "What would Jesus do?" banners out there, and it wasn't originally intended to be a sort of confrontation between the church, between the protesters and the cathedral, but some felt there was a bit of that. The cathedral precincts, St Paul's Cathedral precincts, have always been a place of public debate, right back to the Middle Ages. It's been a place of public debate. I felt that this was an important public debate, especially in the light of the financial crisis. And though it was inconvenient, I didn't think it was anything more than inconvenient. But others disagreed, and there was a move to evict the protesters. And I couldn't go along with the eviction. So I resigned from St Paul's over that and went to the parish that I'm in now. And though it was a hard thing, in a sense it wasn't a hard thing to do at the time.
Why, you think, were they evicted?
Why were they evicted?
Because they were just outside there doing,
well there was the case for evicting the protesters, I think, was overmade. But it's still the case that there was a certain degree of public order. There were public order issues. There were sanitation issues. There were safety issues. There were genuine issues. I'm not trying to deny that, but I think they could have been managed. That's what I think. And and in fact, when I explained my resignation before I did it to my children, I showed them a YouTube clip of the eviction of, it was a much smaller one, it was Occupy Melbourne, actually, that had happened just before. It was a very brutal eviction, the police coming in and bashing these people with clubs, rubber truncheons. And I was like, I can't be, the church can't sanction that. Just can't sanction that. So, I put it that way, it was just a straight, it was before Red Line became something, had different associations.
That's a slightly controversial question.
Yes, of
on that,
course.
because when you've defended this in public, you've focused, I think, largely on the freedom of speech issue, saying these people have the right to peaceful protest, they're there, and that's fine. Was it not also your sort of political sympathy for the movement?
Well,
the controversial question would be,
yes.
would you have done the same thing if this had been a bunch of white supremacists?
Maybe not. Okay, maybe not. I'm not trying to hold up myself as some particular paragon of free speech, and I.
No, it's not a criticism.
I don't think I would. I hope.
Curiosity.
No, I probably wouldn't with white supremacists. I would have been. I hope I would have been as concerned about issues of free speech if your example isn't quite as extreme.
Okay, fair enough. Yeah.
But I can't deny, of course, that I also was, my job was to encourage public debate, and this was, on the steps of St Paul's, one of the great public debates of the time. People were talking about this in the pub, through this. And also, yes, I did have sympathy with them. Now, I hoped I could make a distinction between the sympathy I had for them and the desire I had for the church not to, send in the riot squad.
You've been very outspoken politically on a range of issues. Do you see that as, how do you see the link between your political views and your political actions, or whatever you want to call them, interventions, and your faith?
I've never bought this idea that faith was something that should stay sort of neutral on political issues. It seems to me that the sorts of things that are being said in the Gospels have considerable political import. Jesus was crucified by a political process for being, quote unquote, political. And I think the Anglican Church is a little bit too neutral and vanilla on political questions when it should be more active.
Not too long ago, the Bishop of Sheffield gave a sermon here where he said basically what you're saying is, as well. And he said something like, I haven't aroused any political controversy yet, but I'm looking forward to the moment that I will.
But also, the other thing is, I don't see why I shouldn't have political views as a priest. I mean, and there's some of my political views that are not, that they don't particularly grow out of my theology. So people see that, you're a priest, so they think that it must be all about God when you're talking about politics, but not all of the case. It's not all the case it's not all the time that's the case. And my political views have changed. I mean, they changed quite a lot. So
I suppose one of the worries people have is that, you've got this big hammer, as it were. Almost tempted to put it in Nietzschean terms.
That is a Nietzschean image, yes. Doing philosophy with a hammer.
Yeah, yes. And then doing politics with the hammer, and the hammer being God. So that one's political views that there's a danger that they become absolutist, as in, God is against cruise missiles, or God is in favor of Occupy. Isn't that then a threat to faith, to religion?
I don't think religion is in this country is the big sort of like the hammer that you think it is, that people are going to rally to. They suddenly think that a clergyman has views. Normally, it's a way of discounting. People discount my views because of my faith. So I don't think it. I don't think I'm drawing upon them to elicit greater sympathy for my views. Funnily enough, the campaign for nuclear disarmament was started in the house that I lived in St. Paul's. Look, I mean, I don't know. I don't know how to answer you.
And then
really.
The argument was God is against nuclear weapons.
Yeah.
Because
and you can tell me the opposite. And you can tell me God is not against nuclear weapons. And we can sit here in public and we can argue about it. Great.
Well, wouldn't it be better to say, I mean, it's a question rather than a statement.
Yes.
Maybe that's a political question that God has nothing to say about.
Well, if I think that's what I'd say. If I think that's what I say. But if I think the potential annihilation of the human race is something that God may or may not have a view about, okay, that seems to be perfectly acceptable to think that God might have a view about that, then I see no reason why I shouldn't say it. No, I'm quite unapologetic about bringing religion and politics into the same space. But religion is not an absolute, I mean, especially the way in which Anglicans do it, but religion is something we can argue about. Theology is something we can argue about. So you and I could sit here and you could tell me why I'm wrong about that. And we would have an interesting debate.
Because you see the same thing in America, for example, where the evangelicals are very strong and are pushing for certain political positions.
Yes, most of them are wrong.
And I was going to say, and most or even all of them might be positions that you and I don't agree with.
Yes.
But they put the power of the church, as they see it, behind those ideas.
Listen, maybe it's because we've stopped debating theologically. We've lost the idea that you can debate theologically. We only think that theology is sort of like something that drops from on high. The Bible says so, so you do it. Theology is, the disagreements about theology have driven Western culture and Western disagreements for hundreds of years. That's the, political controversy have been couched in the Reformation, so forth. These things go together. And political and religious debate is part of what your history of ideas is your thing. As you know, they drive, religious ideas and religious debate has driven the history of ideas as much as, political debate.
So your criticism of the Church of England, would be that it's been, as you, I think, put it, too vanilla and maybe even too cowardly, or certainly too cautious, rather than too aggressive.
I'm not going to say cowardly, but
too cautious.
Yes, I mean, I think I wish we would have. Look, the Church of England is. I think there's a particular reason. I think it's very interesting. My own particular take on the Church of England is the Church of England reinvented itself after the English Civil War as a sort of temple of national togetherness. And the whole idea that we would sort of stick each other with pitchforks over our interpretation of the Bible was something that we're not going to do that anymore. We're going to sit alongside each other in the pews, and we're not going to talk about theology because that's divisive stuff. And we're just going to pray together and sing hymns together, and the priest is going to be a pastor above all. Now that idea, I sort of have some, especially rather today, I have some sympathy with, the need for some place of national togetherness.
In a country, a world that is so divided.
Yes, and Brexit and all those sorts of things. But, I mean, I'm more of a scrapper than a pastor in a church that has lots of pastors.
Yeah. I mean, some things are, and your views on this are well known, but some things are disappointing when the Church of England talks about sex and says, sex is only for married heterosexual couples. That seems a fair bit behind the times.
Well, I don't care about being behind the times. I don't have this great liberal idea of progress that we've got to, so I don't subscribe to that. I just think they're wrong, okay? I think they're wrong about people. I think they're morally wrong. I think the way in which the church has denigrated people who are gay for centuries has been a historic mistake. But
there is progress behind that. I mean, in the sense that I have no doubt that within 50 years' time, the church will arrive. Sounds a bit arrogant to say, but the church will arrive at a more reasonable position, or what you and I consider to be a more reasonable position.
Okay, well, we won't argue about the philosophy of history, which is really what I'm talking about when I talk about progress. Though I have a particular sort of animus against, the idea that history is always advancing. But okay, let's call it progress. I had a whole discussion
about that with John Gray.
Yeah,
I now
exactly
understand why you're such a fan of John Gray.
I'm a massive fan of John Gray, and he's completely right on this subject.
And why I am so sceptical.
Okay.
Let's come back to St. Paul's Cathedral. When you then resigned, that must have been pretty tough, because again, it was a good job. You would, by as lots of people think, you did a really good job there, and suddenly you're left with nothing.
It's very hard.
How did you cope with that?
It was very hard. Personally, it was very hard. And I didn't know it was going to be so hard. And in the years that follows, there's a big knock to your ego. I got divorced. There was, there's all sorts of things that happen in the future. One of the things that saved me is psychotherapy. Psychotherapy saved me. I went through a long, few years of psychotherapy. And that sort of, there was a renewal, very painful renewal, but there was a real renewal in that period. But it was horrible. It was horrible.
It's interesting that you say psychotherapy rather than faith. I'm not saying that the two are exclusive. I don't think they are.
No.
But what kind of? I don't want to be
Freudian sort of.
Yeah.
It was. I mean, it was eclectic. Most analysts these days are pretty eclectic. So it was a pretty eclectic, but broadly Freudian based, I guess. It was you feel sort of taken apart and put back together in some way through that process. You look at your demons, and they look back at you, and it's a sort of it's a whatever doesn't kill you makes you stronger type of experience.
And it's not that dissimilar in many ways from religion, because it's the confession and reflecting upon your sins or your past and so on is a religious thing, but also is psychotherapeutic or psychoanalytical thing.
Yeah, so it doesn't have the concept of sin built into it. It doesn't have that sort of more judgmental side. You explore some of the things that have troubled you that you didn't know about, and some things came out of it which were real surprise to me. I mean, so one of the things that happened, the sort of story, and I'm writing a book which is hopefully coming out this year, which sort of begins from this story, is that when I resigned from St Paul's, the Bishop of London said, why don't you go and look at a job in Liverpool? It was the Dean of the Cathedral in Liverpool. And I thought, do I really want to go and do this? I don't like going out to London very much, and it's not me, and I don't know anybody there, and so forth. So I went on the train up to Liverpool, and I was there a few hours early, and I remembered when I was waiting that I had one small, very tenuous connection with Liverpool, which is that my great-great-grandfather's brother was the rabbi of the Prince's Road Synagogue, right next to the cathedral, pretty much, about a mile away. And so I got a taxi up there, and I knocked on the door of the synagogue. And there was a caretaker that let me in. And I said, I know this is silly, but Samuel Friederberg, the rabbi who was here 35 years, and he said, yes, of course, come on through. And there was a great big oil painting. And I spent a bit of time looking at this oil painting, and I thinking to myself, my word, there's like all these, my history on my father's side, all Jewish. And it's sort of, what happened to it? Maybe I just don't fit in the Anglican thing. And I went outside and sat on the road, and it was a very intense emotional moment. It was the first time I cried after the Occupy thing. I'd sort of held it all together. And it was like, suddenly the story, the thing that took me was what happened to this sort of history of fitting in that my family have done for hundreds of years in this country, changing the name from Friederberg to Fraser, doing everything to become good little, English people, and then good little Anglicans. I was the perfect, assimilated Jew in a way, and I couldn't do it. So, for me, that became the way in which I started to think about what happened at St Paul's.
You still felt too much at home within the Anglican Church.
There was a part of me. There's always a small part of me that thinks I don't belong to it, and I think that sense of do I really belong was sort of exploded through the St Paul's thing. So I think that was part of the psychoanalytic sort of exploration. Very valuable, and I've got a book about it now actually, which is fingers crossed it's going to be okay.
Spoiler alert, maybe. Talk a little bit about the book, what it is that you're trying to do in the book.
Well, it's a sort of a memoir, and it's about my relationship to Judaism, and it's complicated to write. It sort of started with me being terribly low, and it ended with me being terribly happy. There was a moment of the real moment where things changed for me in the book. It started by being called not chosen, so not the chosen people. I'm not Jewish, but my wife, who I married, is Israeli, and we speak Hebrew at home. I speak Hebrew badly at home, and my kids. So I have this complicated relationship with Judaism, and my father's past and everything like that. And there was a really lovely moment that happened. Maybe this is when I felt so much of the sort of pain of that just ebb away. When my mother-in-law sat me down, she's Israeli, and she said, tell me about your book. And I said, it's called Not Chosen. It's about not being Jewish. And she said, no, the wrong title. I said, what do you mean? She goes, my daughter's chosen you. I said, my family's chosen you. We've all chosen you in our family, Tel Aviv. We said, it's the wrong title. The book must be called Chosen. And I said, okay.
That's rather touching, actually.
And the book's called Chosen. Yeah. So it's, and in fact, the book is probably a transition from not chosen to chosen, which has obviously a religious type of feeling to it, though my mother-in-law is entirely secular. That was the journey. That describes something more of the journey that I've been on for the last 10 years or so. Yeah.
And other than writing the book, you've been a priest, not at St Paul's. How has that been? Lovely.
It was hard at first because I was a bit of a mess. But so I'm the parish priest of a parish next to the Elephant and Castle. Mm-hmm. Great church, small, bombed in the war, destroyed, and this rather sort of 60s sort of church built up. It's a black majority church, I guess, probably the majority from West Africa originally. it's a great place to be. It's been an absolute great place to be, and I've loved it.
And maybe the other thing that would interest me is you're not only a priest but also a broadcaster and a journalist, very politically active, and we've talked about some of these things. Do you think that the two sometimes clash, as in, as a priest you're supposed to do God's work, but of course as a broadcaster one of the things nowadays one has to do is also sell oneself, as it were. So, you know, the celebrity status which
yes.
have, does it sometimes get into you know, that you develop a kind of what in the Middle Ages was called, I think, a superbia, a kind of sort of hubris
Well, that might be true. I mean, that might be something that I take to my prayers as something that's problematic about me, ego, all those sorts of things. But one of the great things about it doesn't really happen in my church. And I'll tell you a story about that, is that I'd been there for 2 years. Mm-hmm. No, it wasn't that long. It was less than that. And someone said to me, Father, said, we've seen you in the newspaper. And I said, oh, that's great. And we've pinned it up at the back of church. Mm-hmm. And I said, oh, that's lovely. Come and see. And there was a little passage from the South London Gazette. There was a little piece like that about the South London Gazette. Nobody knew that I was writing for The Guardian or was broadcasting, or people do now. But I mean, it took a long time for people to know that I did all those sorts of things. They don't clash very often, but they do sometimes. And, you know, when they do, it's sort of, you know, we talk about it.
Okay. Final question, and a typical question of an academic. What project are you working on now in terms of your writing and your thoughts and your sort of feelings?
Well, I'm finishing off the book. I'm finishing off this book, so that's the thing. I've got another book project that's just beginning to sort of like bubble up, which I probably can't talk to you about. Oh, well, I will talk to you about it. I will. If I'm in trouble from the publishers, so what? I might be writing a book about hypocrisy. I'm interested in hypocrisy as an idea. I think it's very interesting politically, philosophically, psychoanalytically. I think there's lots of interesting things, and I'm thinking at the moment about why hypocrisy has become the sort of the thing that you nowadays is the sort of major thing that you can throw at somebody. I think in a way that it never was. I think it may be a sort of greater moral crime today, or even the greatest moral crime you can throw at someone.
Can you give an example of that?
Well, I think that social media uses hypocrisy a lot. I mean, I think part of the reason for this is that in a culture that's more relativistic, the only way in which you get to judge someone is by the things that they themselves have said. So there's no external standard that you haven't met. Mm-hmm. The only standard that you haven't met is the standard that you yourself have ascribed to. So hypocrisy is going to be about the only thing you can hold someone to in such a... So there's a gap between what you say and what you do, what you think.
But don't you think that in many ways we live in a society which is much more hypocritical than in the past? I mean, via social media, what we do is we project an image of ourselves which isn't us. Or if there's a misstep, we misspeak or whatever, then the thing to do nowadays is these enormous, profuse apologies, and basically everyone knows you don't mean that.
So that's why it's an interesting moral subject, and it does seem to be, I agree with you, it does seem to be more prominent now, virtue signalling and all that sort of stuff. I'm not against virtue signalling, by the way. I think we should all signal our virtue a bit. But I think there's issues about... I am, broadly speaking, sympathetic to the hypocrite. I'm broadly speaking sympathetic to the hypocrite because I think the gap between what we say and what we do is often... There's often a gap between what we say and what we do. And I think we should interrogate it a little bit more intelligently and a little bit more sympathetically.
Okay, but don't you think that then the hypocrisy, the saying something, very often takes the place of doing something? Yes. So we see social activism, in inverted commas, on Twitter, the woke culture and so on. And
Yeah.
I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with that, but very often it
Oh, I think there's something wrong.
it
I think
takes-
there's a lot wrong with it.
it takes the place of actually doing something.
Yes, of course that's true. Of course that's true.
So you've got a
Absolutely.
hypocritical statement, and then everyone says, "Oh, this is great and fantastic."
there's a
and
very
you're
interesting-
so honest and decent and so on, because you've said something in favour of one particular group or whatever it is. But you're not actually like a priest or whoever it is, a social worker, actually working for these people and,
Yes.
and doing something for them
Yes.
on the ground.
I'm also slightly suspicious of those people who trim their moral proclamation to their ability. So if all you're able, if you go, I'm not a good person, so I'm not going to make any, I'm never going to reach, I'm never going to attain any decent moral standard. So I won't think there's anything wrong about that. I'll just say, I don't claim to be good. I'm not being good. So what? I think that there's something okay, understandable, put it this way, about those of us who are not good people making a sort of claim about what they think morality should be and trying to be drawn by that claim, even though not always fully. And in fact, that's sort of what I'm going to be talking about at the lecture tonight.
Okay, then we will leave that for this evening. Giles Fraser, thank you very much for doing this interview.
Thank you.